Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet and the lights dim, let us travel back in time. We're not looking for the thunder of battle or the shouting of politicians, but for the quiet, everyday moments that make up the fabric of history. We're going to explore a question that has haunted the decades since the end of the Great War. What did the people in the streets, the shops, and the living rooms of Germany really know about the tragedy unfolding in their midst? Imagine, if you will, a small town in central Germany during the mid-1930s. The evening air is cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp stone. The cobblestones underfoot are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. In this world, the news does not arrive in an instant flash on a screen. It arrives in the rustle of a newspaper, the crackle of a radio, and, most importantly, in the whispers exchanged over a garden fence or a glass of beer. For a long time after the war, a comfortingly simple story was told. It was the story of a people kept in total darkness, a nation led by a small group of fanatics who committed their crimes in secret, deep in the forests of the East, far from the eyes of the ordinary citizen. But as we sit here in the stillness of the present, looking back through the archives and the diaries of those who lived it, we find a reality that is much more complex, much more human, and much more unsettling. It is the story of the open secret. The journey begins in 1933. It is a year of transition, a year where the old world of the Weimar Republic is beginning to fray at the edges. For the average German, life feels like it is finally stabilizing after years of economic chaos. But if you look closely at the details of daily life, you start to see the first cracks. It begins with the signs. In April of that year, a young man walking to work might see his neighbors standing outside a local department store. They are wearing brown uniforms, and they are holding placards. They aren't shouting. They are simply standing there, suggesting that good Germans should shop elsewhere. This was the first layer of knowledge. It wasn't a secret. It was a spectacle. To live in Germany in 1933 was to see, with your own eyes, the beginning of a great exclusion. You knew that your Jewish doctor, the man who had treated your children for a decade, was suddenly no longer allowed to practice in the local hospital. You knew that the lawyer down the street had lost his license. You didn't need a secret report to know these things. You saw the empty offices. You saw the names removed from the brass plates on the doors. This was knowledge as a physical presence in the street. As the months turned into years, the exclusion became a part of the rhythm of life. Think of the schoolrooms. A teacher stands before a chalkboard, showing a diagram of bloodlines. The children, with their eyes wide and curious, are taught to categorize their friends. The parents at home see the textbooks. They hear the songs their children bring back from the Hitler Youth meetings. The knowledge was being woven into the very education of the next generation. It was in the air, as common as the weather. Then there was the radio, the Volksempfänger, or the People's Receiver. It sat on the mantel in millions of homes, a small, dark box that brought the voice of the state into the private sanctuary of the family. The broadcasts didn't speak of massacres, not yet. They spoke of cleansing the nation. They spoke of parasites and foreign elements. The language was metaphorical, but the intent was clear. To listen to the radio in 1935 was to be told daily that a certain group of people did not belong in your world. The German public knew that their Jewish neighbors were being dehumanized because they were the ones being told to do the dehumanizing. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this early period was the existence of the camps. We often think of the concentration camps as hidden horrors, but the very first one, Dachau, was not a secret. When it opened in 1933, just outside of Munich, it was announced in the newspapers. It was presented as a place for political education. The public knew that if you spoke too loudly against the regime, or if you belonged to the wrong political party, you might be sent there. In the quiet of the night, people would whisper about Dachau. It became a shadow that hung over every conversation. "Be careful," a mother might tell her husband, "or you'll end up in the camp." The knowledge of the camps served a specific purpose for the state. It was a tool of fear. You didn't need to know exactly what happened behind the barbed wire to know that you didn't want to find out. The silence of the public was not born of ignorance, but of a very clear understanding of the consequences of curiosity. As we move into 1935, we see the arrival of the Nuremberg laws. These were not secret decrees passed in the middle of the night. They were the centerpieces of the great Nazi Party rallies, broadcast to the entire nation. Every citizen was suddenly required to look into their own past, to dig through church records and family Bibles to prove their purity. In doing so, everyone became a participant in the machinery of the state. You knew who among your friends had a Jewish grandmother, because they were the ones who suddenly looked frightened when the new laws were read out. The knowledge was no longer just something you saw on a poster. It was something you had to document in your own family tree. The world seemed to shrink for those who were targeted, and for those who were not, the world simply became quieter. Imagine a park in Berlin in 1936. The sun is shining, and the trees are heavy with green leaves. But as you walk along the path, you notice that some of the benches have been painted bright yellow. They bear the words, "Not for Jews." You see an elderly woman, someone who might remind you of your own mother, standing because she is no longer allowed to sit. You see the children playing in the grass, while other children are forced to stand on the sidewalk and watch. To know that this was happening did not require a high-level security clearance. It only required you to keep your eyes open as you walked through the park. And yet, this is where the human mind performs its most remarkable feat: the ability to see and yet not perceive. Many people looked at those yellow benches and simply saw a new rule of the landscape, as unremarkable as a change in the traffic lights. They knew the benches were there, but they chose not to know what the benches meant. The year 1938 brought the most undeniable proof of all. By this time, the social death of the Jewish community was almost complete. They had been stripped of their jobs, their rights, and their dignity. But on the night of November 9th, the violence turned physical and public. This was Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Try to imagine the sound. In the deep silence of a November night, the sound of thousands of windows shattering at once. It is a sharp, crystalline sound that carries for miles in the cold air. In every city across Germany, the synagogues, the beautiful, historic centers of Jewish life, were set on fire. The flames rose high into the night sky, casting long, flickering shadows on the faces of the crowds who gathered to watch. The next morning, the sun rose on a different country. The sidewalks were covered in a thick layer of glass that crunched like fallen snow under the boots of the commuters going to work. The air smelled of smoke and charred wood. Every German who left their house that morning saw the destruction. They saw the smoldering ruins of the buildings where their neighbors had prayed. They saw the shop fronts looted and empty. There was no knowing nothing on November 10th, 1938. The evidence was stuck to the soles of your shoes. The state didn't even try to hide it. In fact, they blamed the victims and fined the Jewish community for the cleanup. The public knew that the law no longer protected a certain group of people. They knew that their government was capable of organized mass violence in broad daylight. What is most striking about this period is the way the knowledge was processed. People didn't talk about it in the streets. They didn't protest. Instead, they went home and closed their doors. They focused on their own lives, their own families, their own struggles. Historians often describe this as a road built by hatred, but paved with indifference. It was a slow, steady numbing of the conscience. If you see a neighbor disappear, and you are told they have been resettled, and you then see their furniture being auctioned off in the town square, you know that they are not coming back. You know that their life has been dismantled. You might not know about the gas chambers yet. Those would come later, in the secret heart of the war. But you knew that your neighbor had been erased from your world, and that the state had done it with the help of the police, the banks, and the neighbors themselves. By the end of 1938, the German people knew that the Jewish population was being systematically destroyed as a social and economic force. They had seen the laws, they had seen the camps, they had heard the radio, and they had walked over the broken glass. The open secret was already there, hiding in plain sight. It was in the empty chair at the dinner table, the shuttered shop on the corner, and the yellow bench in the park. The weight of this silence began to grow. As the 1930s drew to a close, a new sound began to fill the air, the sound of marching boots and the heavy rumble of tanks. The internal war against a portion of the German population was about to merge with a global conflict. And as the borders of the Reich expanded, the methods of persecution would shift from the public streets to the hidden corners of an occupied continent. In the early months of the war, the nature of what was known began to change. It was no longer just about yellow benches or broken windows. It became about the East. That word, Osten, began to carry a heavy, dark weight in the German vocabulary. When families were rounded up and taken to the train stations, they were told they were being sent to work, to build new lives in the newly conquered territories. But back in the quiet towns of Germany, people began to notice the discrepancies. They noticed that the elderly and the sick were also being resettled for labor. They noticed that the letters coming back from these families were few and far between, and eventually they stopped altogether. They noticed that the clothing and jewelry of those who had left were being sold in local markets. The knowledge was like a puzzle. Each citizen held a few pieces. The soldier on leave from Poland held a piece. He had seen the mass shootings in the forests. The railway worker held a piece. He saw the cattle cars, packed with people, heading toward destinations that didn't appear on any civilian map. The office clerk held a piece. She saw the lists of names being crossed off, the bank accounts being frozen, the properties being retitled. Individually, these pieces were disturbing. Together, they formed a picture of a magnitude so great that many people found it impossible to fully grasp. It was a form of cognitive dissonance. To believe the full truth was to believe that your nation, your government, and perhaps even your sons and husbands were participating in something beyond human comprehension. And so, the silence deepened. It was a silence born of fear, yes, but also of a desperate need to maintain the illusion of a normal life. You could ignore the rumors if you focused on the rationing cards. You could look away from the empty house next door if you were worried about the air raid sirens. The war provided a perfect veil. It allowed the open secret to retreat into the shadows of military necessity. But the whispers never truly stopped. In the breadlines, in the factories, and in the bombed-out basements of the later war years, the truth was always there, just beneath the surface. It was a ghost that haunted the German conscience, a presence that required more and more energy to ignore. As we look back at these years, we see that the question of, what did they know, is perhaps the wrong question. The more accurate question is, How did they live with what they knew? It is a story of how a society can slowly, almost imperceptibly, lose its moral compass when the light of truth is replaced by the fog of propaganda and the darkness of fear. The glass on the sidewalk in 1938 was just the beginning. The journey from that broken glass to the silent chimneys of the East was a long one, but it was a path that was visible to anyone who dared to look. And as the war progressed, that path would only become wider, darker, and more difficult to ignore, until finally the world could no longer look away. As the fire in the hearth flickers lower, casting long, gentle shadows against the wall, we move further into the heart of the night, and deeper into the memory of a world at war. We have seen how the 1930s laid the foundation of the open secret through laws and broken glass. But now, as the year 1941 dawns, the atmosphere in Germany shifts. The air feels heavier, the whispers in the streets more hurried. The war, once a series of distant victories, is beginning to cast a much longer shadow over the domestic life of every German citizen. And with that shadow comes a new, more terrifying form of knowledge. Imagine, if you will, the early autumn of 1941. The leaves are turning gold and brittle, and a new decree has just been posted on the pillars of every city. It is a simple order, but one that changes the visual landscape of Germany overnight. Every Jewish person over the age of 6 is now required to wear a yellow star, the Judenstern, stitched firmly to their outer clothing. For the average German, this was a moment of profound confrontation. Up until this point, many could pretend they didn't know who was being targeted. They could look away from the empty shops or the missing neighbors. But now, the other was marked with a bright, inescapable symbol. You would see them at the grocery store, restricted to the late afternoon hours when the shelves were nearly bare. You would see them on the trams, standing in the designated areas, their heads bowed. You saw the children the same age as your own, wearing that star on their way to school. To know that this was happening did not require a secret radio or a hidden document. It was there, in the queue for bread, in the seat next to you on the train. The yellow star was a constant visual reminder that a segment of your own community had been branded as outside the law. And when those stars began to disappear from the streets, the knowledge shifted again. Try to picture a quiet neighborhood in a city like Cologne or Frankfurt. One morning, a heavy truck pulls up to the apartment building across the street. Men in uniforms emerge, and soon, the Jewish families who lived there are led out. They are carrying only what they can fit into a single suitcase. There is no shouting, no drama, just the rhythmic sound of boots on pavement and the low murmur of instructions. The neighbors watch from behind their lace curtains. They don't open their windows, but they don't look away either. They see the families loaded into the trucks. They see the doors to the apartments sealed with wax. Within days, a new kind of notice appears in the local paper. It is an announcement for an auction. The state-confiscated property of those who have been evacuated to the east is to be sold to the public. And so, the ordinary citizens of the town gather. They walk through the rooms where their neighbors once lived. They run their hands over the fine linens. They test the weight of the silver spoons. They admire the craftsmanship of a mahogany wardrobe. They buy these things for a pittance, pennies on the mark. When you bring a clock into your home that belonged to a family you watch being taken away, you are no longer a bystander. You hold the evidence of their erasure in your very hands. The knowledge was in the kitchen cabinets, the bedroom sets, and the warm winter coats that were redistributed to the Aryan public. Everyone knew the previous owners were gone. and as they used their furniture and wore their clothes, they entered into a silent pact. For them to keep these things, the owners must never return. But where were they going? The official word was resettlement in the East. It was a vague, comforting term that suggested work camps or new colonies. But the truth was far more porous than the Nazi state intended. The East was not a black hole. It was a destination for millions of German soldiers, and those soldiers were writing home. Imagine a kitchen table in a small village. A mother sits by the light of a single candle, reading a letter from her son on the Eastern Front. He is a regular soldier, not a member of the SS, but his unit is stationed behind the front lines in Ukraine. In his letter, his tone is different than it used to be. He doesn't talk about the glory of the Reich. Instead, he writes of terrible things he has seen in the ravines outside of towns like Kiev or Minsk. He mentions the actions where thousands of people were marched into the woods and the sound of gunfire that didn't stop until nightfall. These letters, hundreds of thousands of them, flowed back into Germany like a dark tide. They were shared among family members, whispered about over garden fences. The Holocaust by bullets, the mass shootings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, was the most visible phase of the genocide. It happened in the open, in the forests and fields of Eastern Europe, witnessed by ordinary soldiers who then became the primary carriers of this news back to the home front. When these soldiers came home on leave, they brought more than just letters. They brought stories. They sat in the local Gasthof, their eyes hollow, and after a few drinks, the state secrets began to spill out. They talked about the pits, the gas vans, and the smell of death that hung over the landscape. Sometimes they even brought photographs, grainy, illicit snapshots of the killings that were passed around from hand to hand. The German public didn't need a formal announcement from the Ministry of Propaganda to know that resettlement was a death sentence. They had the word of their own sons and husbands. As the war progressed and the air raid sirens began to wail over German cities, a new source of knowledge emerged: the enemy radio. Listening to the BBC or other foreign stations was a radio crime, punishable by imprisonment or even death. And yet, millions of Germans did it. In the dead of night, they would huddle around their Volksempfänger, the small Bakelite radios, with the volume turned so low it was almost a hum. From the speakers came the calm, measured voice of Thomas Mann, or the newsreaders in London, and what they said was specific. By 1942, the BBC was broadcasting detailed reports about the death camps in Poland. They named the places: Chelmno, Belzec, Treblinka. They described the use of gas. They gave numbers: hundreds of thousands, then millions. In the morning, this news would travel through the whisper post, the informal network of Mund propaganda. It moved from the factory floor to the grocery line. "Did you hear what they said on London last night?" one woman might ask another. They would often dismiss it as enemy propaganda to protect themselves. But the seed of doubt was planted. The rumors from the radio perfectly matched the rumors from the soldiers on leave. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, and the picture they formed was one of unimaginable horror. There was another, even more chilling piece of evidence that the public had already seen with their own eyes. Long before the gas chambers were built in the East, the Nazi regime had perfected the technology of mass murder within Germany itself. This was the T4 euthanasia program, the systematic killing of the disabled and the mentally ill. Grey buses with blackened windows were a common sight in towns near sanatoriums like Hadamar or Greifswald. The local townspeople watched these buses arrive full and leave empty. They saw the smoke rising from the chimneys, smoke that was dark and smelled of scorched flesh. They noticed that the patients never came back, and the families were sent identical letters of condolence, often citing impossible causes of death. The knowledge of the T4 program was so widespread that it led to the only major public protest against Nazi atrocities during the war. When Bishop von Galen denounced the killings from his pulpit, the public support for his words was so overwhelming that Hitler was forced to officially stop the program. But the lesson was learned by the public. They knew that the state was capable of industrial murder, and they knew how it was done. When the rumors of the gas began to filter back from the east a year later, the German public didn't find them hard to believe. They had already smelled the smoke in their own backyard. As we move deeper into the war years, we must also consider the knowledge of the railways. Germany's rail system was the pride of the nation, a vast, efficient machine. But by 1943, that machine was being used to transport millions of people to their deaths. Thousands of ordinary railway workers, engineers, switchmen, station masters, saw the trains. They saw the cattle cars packed so tightly that people were gasping for air through the slats. They saw the destinations on the manifests: Auschwitz, Sobibor, Majdanek. These workers went home at night to their wives and children. They talked. They mentioned the special trains that always had priority, even over the wounded soldiers coming from the front. They talked about the smell that lingered on the tracks long after the trains had passed. The open secret was travelling along the very arteries of the nation, visible to anyone who worked the rails or lived near a junction. And then there was the knowledge of the camps within Germany itself. While the extermination camps were primarily in occupied Poland, the Reich was dotted with thousands of concentration and labor camps. Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. These were not hidden in forests. They were often located just outside major cities, or even in the middle of industrial areas. Prisoners in their striped pajamas were a common sight. They were marched through the streets to work in local factories, overseen by guards with dogs. They worked in the BMW plants, the IG Farben labs, and the underground V2 rocket tunnels. The civilian workers in these factories worked side by side with the prisoners. They saw their skeletal frames, their bruised skin, their hollow eyes. They saw them collapse from hunger and be beaten by the guards. To live in an industrial city in Germany in 1944 was to see the shadow people every single day. You didn't need to know about the gas chambers to know that your nation was built on a foundation of slavery and death. As the night deepens and we reflect on these overlapping layers of knowledge, a haunting question remains. If so many knew so much, why was there such a profound silence? Part of the answer lies in the sheer, paralyzing fear of the Gestapo. In a totalitarian state, knowledge is a dangerous burden. To admit you knew was to admit you had a moral responsibility to act, and action meant certain death. And so, many Germans chose a path of inner emigration. They retreated into their private lives, focusing on the immediate needs of survival, rationing cards, air raid shelters, the fate of their own loved ones. They built a wall around their hearts, a wall made of indifference and selective looking away. But there was also something more subtle at work, a collective psychological defense. If you accept that your nation is committing a crime of this magnitude, you must also accept that your nation, and by extension, you, is lost. Many people simply could not allow themselves to believe the full truth, even when the evidence was sitting on their own bookshelves or dinner tables. They chose to believe the resettlement lie because the alternative was too horrific to contemplate. By the final years of the war, The open secret had become an atmosphere. It was like the dust from the bombings. It was everywhere, coating every surface, breathed in by everyone, yet rarely mentioned by name. It was in the letters from the front, the auctions in the town square, the whispers from the radio, the smoke from the T4 chimneys, and the striped uniforms in the factory. The tragedy of the German people was not that they were blind. It was that they were forced to live in a world where the light of the truth was so bright it was blinding, and they had to squint just to keep walking. They knew that the East was a place of no return. They knew that their neighbors were gone, and they knew that the world was closing in on them, coming to settle the account for everything they had seen, everything they had heard, and everything they had chosen not to say. The journey into the open secret now moves into the later years of the war, as the boundaries between the hidden atrocities of the East and the daily reality of the German home front began to dissolve entirely. If the earlier years were defined by laws and whispers, the period from 1943 to 1945 was defined by the physical presence of the Holocaust within the very heart of the Reich. The secret was no longer just something one heard about. It was something one stepped over on the way to the market. To understand this transition, we must look at the iron veins of the nation, the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German National Railway. In a world at war, the railway was the lifeblood of the country. It carried soldiers to the front, coal to the factories, and grain to the cities. But it also carried the special trains. These were not military transports, and they were not listed on public timetables. Yet they were seen by tens of thousands of ordinary railway employees. Imagine a station master in a small junction town in Saxony or Silesia. He is an ordinary man, perhaps too old for the draft, wearing a clean uniform and carrying a heavy brass whistle. He watches as a train of cattle cars pulls onto a siding to let a troop transport pass. He hears the sounds coming from inside those cars, the crying of children, the desperate pleas for water, the rhythmic pounding of fists against wooden slats. He sees the destination manifests attached to the side of the cars, names like Belzec, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. These railway workers were not SS men. They were civil servants. They went home at night to their families and sat down to dinner. They talked about the Sonderzug, the special trains that always seemed to have priority, even when the army was retreating. They spoke of the stench that lingered in the stations long after the trains had moved on, a smell of unwashed bodies, waste and despair. This knowledge was not a state secret to the men who switched the tracks and signaled the departures. It was a logistical reality of their workday. Through them, the knowledge of the deportations flowed into thousands of households, a steady drip of information that confirmed the darkest rumors of the whisper post. As the war entered its most desperate phase, the industrial landscape of Germany itself became a theater of the Holocaust. By 1943, the German economy was struggling under the weight of total war. To keep the factories running, the regime turned to slave labor on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. There were not just a few major concentration camps. There were over 40,000 subcamps and labor sites scattered across the Reich. In cities like Munich, Stuttgart, and Essen, the striped people, the prisoners in their thin blue and white striped uniforms, became a common sight. They were marched from their barracks to the local factories every morning. They worked in the underground tunnels of the Harz Mountains, in the chemical plants of IG Farben, and in the assembly lines of BMW and Daimler-Benz. Think of the civilian factory worker, a woman whose husband was away at the front, working her shift at an ammunition plant. At the bench next to her, or across the factory floor, stood a prisoner. She saw their skeletal frames, their shaved heads, and the way they trembled with exhaustion. She saw the guards strike them for moving too slowly. There was no wall between the ordinary German and the prisoner. They shared the same air, the same factory floors, and the same fear of the Allied bombs. When those bombs began to fall with increasing frequency, a strange and terrible psychological phenomenon took hold of the German public. As cities like Hamburg and Cologne were turned into infernos, the civilians huddled in their basement shelters didn't just feel fear. Many felt a dark sense of inevitability. There are countless entries in diaries from 1943 and 1944 that speak of the reckoning. People began to whisper that the phosphorus raining down from the sky was a just punishment for what was being done to the Jews. In the flickering light of the candles in those shelters, the open secret took on a spiritual weight. It was no longer just about politics or war. It was about a collective guilt that people felt was being written in fire across their own skylines. They knew that the East had been a place of slaughter, and they feared that the West was now bringing that slaughter home. This guilt fear was perhaps the most honest acknowledgement of the Holocaust that existed during the war. It was an admission that the public knew enough to be terrified of the consequences. But as the Allied armies closed in from both sides in the winter of 1944, the regime made one final, frantic effort to hide the evidence. They began the evacuation of the camps in the east, leading to the death marches. This was the moment when the Holocaust literally walked through the front doors of the German people. Imagine a village in the Bavarian countryside, covered in a thick blanket of January snow. The war feels distant until, suddenly, a column of ghosts appears on the horizon. Thousands of prisoners, evacuated from Auschwitz or Gross Rosen, are being marched westward. They have no coats, their feet are wrapped in rags, and they are being driven by guards who shoot anyone who stumbles. These marches did not bypass the towns, they went straight through them. The villagers watched from their windows as the walking skeletons struggled through the slush. They saw the bodies left in the ditches the next morning. In some towns, the prisoners were herded into local barns for the night, their cries for food and water echoing through the quiet streets. There was no longer any possibility of not knowing. The evidence was lying in the town square. In the town of Palmnicken, civilians watched as thousands of prisoners were driven into the icy Baltic Sea and shot. In the town of Gardelegen, locals saw the smoke from a barn where over 1,000 prisoners had been locked inside and set on fire. These were not hidden acts in a distant forest. They were communal events, witnessed by the butcher, the baker, and the schoolteacher. The reaction of the public in these final months was a complex mixture of horror, pity, and a desperate, self-preserving indifference. Some people risked their lives to leave a few potatoes by the side of the road, or to hide a prisoner in their cellar, but many more simply closed their shutters. They turned up the radio to drown out the sound of the marching feet. They focused on the fact that their own sons were dying at the front, and their own homes were being turned to rubble. The open secret had become an open reality, but it was a reality that the German people were psychologically unequipped to handle. To stop the marches, to help the prisoners, would have required a level of collective resistance that had been crushed out of them over 12 years of terror. They were a people who had grown used to the quiet knowing, and now that the knowing had become a deafening scream, they simply didn't know how to respond. As we look at this final year of the conflict, we see that the geography of the Holocaust had shifted. It was no longer a destination in Poland. It was a path through the Black Forest, a railway siding in Berlin, and a factory floor in the Ruhr Valley. The German people were living inside the machinery of the genocide. They saw the shadow people every day. They heard the rumors of the gas from the BBC. They saw the special trains on the tracks, and they watched the death marches past their homes. The silence that followed the war, the "Wir haben nichts gewusst," was not a reflection of what they had seen, but a reflection of what they were willing to admit. The burden of the knowledge was so great that once the war was over, the only way to move forward was to pretend the secret had never been open at all. But for those who lived through those years, the memory of the striped people and the smell of the Sonderzug remained, a hidden map of a landscape they had all walked through, even if they never spoke its name. The tragedy of the open secret is that it was never a secret at all. It was a shared experience of a nation that had watched its conscience be dismantled piece by piece. As the war reached its end, the truth was no longer a whisper. It was the very ground beneath their feet. And as the Allied soldiers finally entered the camps on German soil, like Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, they didn't just find the victims. They found the neighbors who had lived just a few miles away, neighbors who had watched the smoke, heard the cries, and lived their lives in the shadow of the unthinkable. This is the reality of the later war years, a world where the extraordinary had become ordinary, and where the most horrific crimes in human history were woven into the mundane details of daily survival. It is a story of how a society can hold a truth in its hands and still refuse to see it, and how that refusal becomes the heaviest burden of all when the lights of history are finally turned back on. As the borders of the Reich collapsed and the reality of the camps was laid bare to the world, the German people stood in the ruins of their homes and their ideology. They were faced with the undeniable proof of what they had seen, what they had heard, and what they had participated in, whether through action or through silence. The journey from the quiet knowing to the total revelation was complete, and the world would never be the same again. The story continues as the smoke begins to clear, and the world demands an accounting for the silence that allowed the open secret to grow until it consumed an entire continent. The path from the death marches to the courtroom at Nuremberg was a short one, but for those who had lived in the shadow of the secret, it was a journey that would take a lifetime to truly understand. The transition from a nation at war to a nation in ruins brought a new kind of confrontation with the truth. As the Allied forces moved deeper into the German heartland, the physical evidence of the atrocities became impossible to manage. No longer were the rumors confined to the east or the whispers of soldiers on leave. The open secret was now being uncovered in the woods behind local villages and in the basements of municipal buildings. The liberation of the camps within Germany, places like Belsen, where the local population had provided the guards and the supplies, forced a sudden, violent end to the years of selective looking away. In those final, chaotic weeks of 1945, the psychological wall that the German public had built around itself began to crumble. The fear of Allied retribution, which had fueled the guilt fear during the bombing raids, was now realized. But even then, as the world looked on in horror at the images of the liberated camps, many Germans found one last refuge in their silence. They retreated into a state of 0 hour, a collective amnesia that would take decades to peel away. The knowledge had always been there, layered like sediment in the minds of the people. It was in the eyes of the child who saw the murder buses in 1940, in the hands of the housewife who bought the auctioned Jewish silver in 1942, and in the memory of the railway worker who signaled the trains to Auschwitz in 1944. It was a mosaic of a million tiny observations that, when joined together, formed a picture of a magnitude that the human heart was simply not designed to hold. And so, as the war ended and the reconstruction began, the open secret didn't disappear. It simply changed its form. It became the Great Silence, a weight that sat at the dinner tables of the post-war years, unspoken but ever present. The story of what the German people knew is not just a story of the war. It is a story of how humanity survives the knowledge of its own capacity for indifference. It is a reminder that the truth is always there, waiting in the shadows of our daily lives, and that the greatest challenge is not in finding it, but in having the courage to look at it without blinking. The landscape of the Reich was now a landscape of ruins and graves, and the people who remained had to find a way to live in the wreckage of their own conscience. The open secret had reached its conclusion, but the echo of that silence would continue to ring through the decades, a haunting melody that reminds us of the importance of sight, the necessity of memory, and the enduring power of the truth to find its way home, no matter how deep the darkness. The story of the open secret has brought us through the laws of the 30s, the whispers of the early war, and the visible horrors of the death marches. But now, we must look at the year 1944 and the final gasping months of 1945. This was the period when the open secret underwent its most profound and terrifying transformation. It was no longer a matter of interpreting signs or listening to rumors. It became a pervasive atmospheric reality that saturated the very air of the German heartland. During this time, the distance between the front and the home vanished entirely. The Holocaust, which had begun in the shadows of occupied Poland, was brought directly into the view of the average citizen in ways that made the post-war claim of ignorance a physical and psychological impossibility. To understand this, we must first look at the sky. By 1944, the Allied bombing campaign had turned the German night into a theatre of fire. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and eventually Dresden were being systematically reduced to rubble. For the ordinary German huddling in a basement shelter, the war was no longer about conquest, it was about survival. But in the flickering candlelight of those shelters, a strange and terrible conversation was taking place. Historians and diarists of the time, most notably Victor Klemperer, a Jewish scholar who survived in Dresden, recorded a recurring theme in the hushed talk of civilians. There was a widespread, visceral belief that the fire falling from the heavens was a direct retribution. This is a crucial pillar of our story. This was not a knowing based on a news report. It was a knowing based on a deep-seated sense of cause and effect. People whispered, "If we lose this war, God help us for what we have done to the Jews." This guilt fear was perhaps the most honest acknowledgement of the genocide that existed within the Reich. It proved that the public knew enough about the mass killings in the East to recognize them as a crime of such magnitude that it would naturally draw a divine or historical punishment. They didn't need to know the technical specifications of a gas chamber to understand that a moral boundary had been crossed, and that the burning of their own cities was the bill finally coming due. It was the logic of the guilty. They expected to be punished because they knew what they were being punished for. But the evidence was not just in the sky. It was on the ground, in the very factories and fields where the German public spent their days. As the Reich's manpower was bled dry on the Eastern Front, the domestic economy became entirely dependent on slave labor. This was the era of the Arsenlager, or subcamps. By 1944, there were over 1,000 subcamps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen, integrated directly into the German industrial landscape. These weren't tucked away in the countryside. They were in the middle of residential neighborhoods and industrial zones. Imagine a woman in a town like Essen or Stuttgart. She wakes up, prepares a meager breakfast, and walks to her job at a munitions factory or a textile mill. As she enters the factory gates, she passes a column of prisoners being marched in from a nearby camp. These are not people in a distant land. They are standing right next to her. She sees their striped pajamas, their wooden clogs, and their shaved heads. She smells the scent of malnutrition, unwashed bodies, and disease. Throughout her 10-hour shift, she works alongside them. In these factories, operated by household names like Siemens, IG Farben, Krupp, and even Hugo Boss, the ordinary German and the Holocaust victim occupied the same physical space. There was no secret here. The exploitation and slow death of these people were the very fuel that kept the German war machine turning. Thousands of civilian foremen, engineers, and office clerks managed these prisoner laborers. They signed the requisitions for more material, knowing full well that material meant human beings who would be worked until they perished. They saw the death lists of those too weak to work, who were then sent back to the main camps to be disposed of. The Holocaust had moved out of the Polish forests and onto the German assembly line. Beyond the urban factories, the knowing extended to the German countryside. As foreign laborers and prisoners of war were assigned to work on private farms, the average farmer's family became intimately familiar with the hierarchy of Nazi racial value. They saw who was fed, who was beaten, and who disappeared. The open secret was present at the dinner table and in the barn. As the winter of 1944 turned into the catastrophic spring of 1945, the open secret began to move through the countryside in the form of the death marches. As the Red Army advanced, the SS cleared the camps in the east, driving hundreds of thousands of prisoners westward into the heart of Germany. These were not hidden movements. These were massive, sprawling columns of human misery that clogged the main roads and passed through the centers of thousands of German villages. Picture a quiet Sunday in a village in the Harz Mountains. The snow is thick on the pines. Suddenly, a sound approaches, the sound of thousands of wooden shoes scraping against the frozen earth, accompanied by the barking of dogs and the sharp crack of rifle fire. A column of skeletal figures appears, stretching as far as the eye can see. They are wrapped in rags, their eyes vacant with the Musulman stare, the hollow look of those who have given up on life. The villagers stood on their doorsteps and watched. They saw prisoners shot in the ditches because they could no longer walk. They saw them begging for a drop of water or a scrap of potato. In many cases, the prisoners were herded into local barns or schoolhouses for the night. The local mayors had to provide space. The local farmers had to provide straw. The cries of the dying echoed through the night in towns that, the next morning, would try to return to their normal routines. There was no not knowing when the bodies of the victims were literally lying in the gutters of your street, waiting to be cleared away by the local Hitler Youth. Historians have documented that during these marches, the secrecy of the Holocaust vanished entirely. The guards often spoke openly about where the prisoners had come from and where they were going. In some instances, civilian onlookers even participated in the cruelty, while others, moved by a final flicker of humanity, tried to leave food out, only to be threatened by the SS. This period also saw the total collapse of the language of deception. In the early years, the regime used soft words like resettlement, but by 1945, the mask had slipped. The soldiers returning from the front were no longer talking about victory. They were talking about the Endlösung, the final solution, as a grim, accomplished fact. The whisper post had become a roar. The BBC's reports, which had been specific since 1942, were now being confirmed by the sights on the ground. People knew about the gas, they knew about the ovens. In the town of Dachau, the local residents could see the smoke from the crematorium chimneys from their kitchen windows. They knew what that smell was. They had lived with it for years, and as the end approached, that smell became the scent of their own impending doom. What is perhaps most haunting about this final phase of the open secret is the role of the ordinary person in the final acts of violence. In the closing weeks of the war, as the social order began to dissolve, end-phase crimes broke out across Germany. These were not just committed by the SS, but often by local officials, police, and even members of the Volkssturm, the national militia of old men and boys. In towns like Gardelegen and Celle, local citizens participated in manhunts for escaped prisoners. They hunted them through the woods and the streets like animals. In Gardelegen, over 1,000 prisoners were locked in a barn and burned alive. The local population watched the smoke. This suggests that the knowledge had reached a point of total saturation. The public was so aware of the crimes that had been committed that many felt their only hope was to help finish the job, to destroy the witnesses before the Allies arrived. The silence was no longer born of ignorance, but of a desperate, violent complicity. They were cleaning the crime scene while the police were at the door. And then the 0 hour arrived. As the Allied tanks rolled into German towns, they brought with them a new kind of confrontation. The commanders of the American and British forces, horrified by what they found in camps like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, refused to let the local populations maintain their open secret. They forced the townspeople, the mayors, the shopkeepers, the housewives, to walk through the gates of the camps. They forced them to look at the piles of bodies, to smell the stench of the barracks, and, in some cases, to bury the dead with their own hands. The reactions of these citizens were captured in famous film footage. You see women weeping into their handkerchiefs. You see men staring at the ground, their faces tight and defensive. Some were undoubtedly shocked by the scale of the horror, for even a generalized knowledge does not prepare the human soul for the sight of 10,000 corpses. But for many, the shock was the shock of being caught. It was the shock of the open secret, finally being named aloud by a witness who could not be silenced. When the Allied soldiers asked, "How could you live so close and not know?" the answer was usually a whispered, "Wir haben nichts gewusst." But the evidence was everywhere. It was in the accounts of the local banks that had processed the gold teeth of the victims. It was in the records of the local companies that had supplied the Zyklon B. It was in the homes of the citizens who were still sleeping in Aryanized beds. It was even in the gardens. In some towns near camps, the soil was enriched with the ash from the crematoria, sold as fertilizer. The story of the German people and the Holocaust is not a story of a mystery. It is a story of a society that collectively decided to look away from what was happening on its own doorstep. It is a story of how empathy can be methodically stripped away until the suffering of a neighbor becomes nothing more than background noise. By 1945, the open secret was no longer a secret. It was the atmosphere. It was the dust on the windows, the smoke in the air, and the blood on the road. As the war ended and the Nuremberg trials began, the world struggled to understand how an entire nation could participate in such a silence. But the silence was never a void. It was a wall. It was a wall built of fear, of profit, of propaganda, and of a desperate need to believe that one's own country was still civilized. The knowledge was there, but it was a knowledge without a voice. In the decades that followed, Germany would have to undergo a long, painful process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, of coming to terms with the past. This process was not about discovering new facts. The facts were already known. It was about dismantling the open secret and finally admitting that the empty chair, the yellow bench, the smoke from the chimney, and the marching ghosts were all part of a single horrific truth. The story of what was known is a warning for all time. It tells us that a secret doesn't have to be hidden to be a secret. It only has to be ignored. It tells us that the most dangerous silence is not the silence of the forest, but the silence of the city street. And it reminds us that the truth always remains, waiting for the day when someone is finally brave enough to look it in the eye and call it by its name. As the ruins of the Reich were cleared away and the new Germany began to emerge, the open secret was buried under the foundations of the new buildings. But the earth remembers. The cobblestones that felt the wooden shoes of the death marches are still there. The factory floors where the slave laborers worked are still there. And the memory of what was seen, what was heard, and what was known remains a part of the air we breathe, a reminder that we are all, at every moment, the keepers of our neighbor's dignity, and that our greatest responsibility is to never, ever look away. The path from 1933 to 1945 was a path from a whisper to a scream. And though the scream was stifled by the fog of war and the wall of silence, it never truly stopped. It echoes still, a haunting melody that asks us to remember not just the victims, but the witnesses, and to ask ourselves what we would see if the open secret were to walk past our own windows today. The light of history is a harsh one, but it is the only light that can truly heal. By looking at the shadows of what was known, we ensure that those shadows can never grow that long again. We honor the truth by refusing to let it be a secret, and we honor the victims by acknowledging that they were seen, they were heard, and they were part of a world that chose, for a time, to pretend they did not exist. The year 1945 did not arrive in Germany with a celebratory dawn. It arrived as a hollow, echoing center. For the German people, the transition from the frantic, violent energy of a dying regime to the silent, ash-covered reality of defeat is often called Stunde Null, 0 hour. It was the moment when the clock stopped, the laws vanished, and the open secret finally broke through the fragile crust of daily life to become an unavoidable physical presence. If the previous years were spent in a twilight of selective looking away, the spring and summer of 1945 were a harsh, blinding noon. The secret was no longer whispered. It was shouted by the liberating armies. It was broadcast on every street corner by Allied loudspeaker trucks, and it was laid out in grisly detail on the very doorsteps of the towns that had lived for years in its shadow. To truly understand this period, we must first immerse ourselves in the sensory reality of the liberation. As the American, British, and Soviet forces pushed into the heart of the Reich, they didn't just find military targets or defensive lines. They stumbled upon the vast industrial archipelago of the camp system, places like Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. The soldiers who entered these gates were hardened by years of combat, yet they were shattered by what they found. They found pits filled with thousands of unburied bodies. They found living skeletons who were too weak to cheer their liberators. They found the industrial machinery of death still warm from its last use. The Allied commanders, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, made a deliberate and strategic decision. The German people would not be allowed to retreat into the comfort of ignorance. After visiting the sub-camp of Ohrdruf, Eisenhower was so revolted that he ordered as many American soldiers as possible to visit the site. He famously remarked that one day, some son of a B-100 would stand up and say this never happened, and he wanted the witnesses to be indisputable. But he didn't just want his own soldiers to see it. He wanted the Germans to see it. In towns across the country, a new and terrifying ritual of confrontation began. Imagine a small town in Thuringia or Bavaria. The war has effectively ended. The local baker, the mayor, and the school teacher are trying to figure out how to find food and water in a world without a currency. Suddenly, Allied soldiers arrive. They don't come to arrest everyone. They come with an order. Every able-bodied citizen, the men who had served in the Home Guard, the women who had worked in the local offices, the teenagers who had been in the Hitler Youth, is to march to the nearby camp. The townspeople were led through the gates they had lived near for years, often just a few miles from their own kitchen tables. They were forced to walk past the piles of corpses. They were forced to stand in the crematorium rooms, where the walls were still stained with soot and the air still carried the scent of ash. In some towns, the Allies went even further to break the open secret. They forced the local population to dig graves with their own hands and to carry the bodies of the victims, one by one, to their final resting place. The reactions of the German public during these forced tours were captured in thousands of photographs and reels of film. You see faces masked by handkerchiefs to block the overwhelming stench of decay. You see women weeping. You see men staring straight ahead with a look of stony, defensive indifference. For some, the shock was soul-shattering, a genuine realization of the scale of the horror. But for others, the shock was the shock of exposure. It was the realization that the wall of not knowing had been torn down, and they were now standing naked before the judgment of history. As the summer of 1945 progressed, the open secret was codified into a national curriculum of guilt. The Allied military government began a massive campaign of re-education. Posters were plastered on the ruins of every German city, on the scorched remains of the Reichstag, on the shells of opera houses, and on the walls of local butcher shops. They showed the piles of bodies from the camps with a single, devastating caption: Diese Schandtaten, Ihre Schuld. These atrocities, your fault. Educational films like Death Mills were shown in makeshift cinemas, and in many regions, attendance was a requirement for receiving food rations. The Allies were attempting to perform a collective psychological surgery, removing the cancer of Nazi ideology by forcing the patient to look at the tumor. But the German public's response was not one of immediate repentance. Instead, it was a retreat into a new, more profound silence. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of the Holocaust, the German public did something remarkable. They retreated into a collective amnesia. The phrase "Wir haben nichts gewusst," we knew nothing, became the national mantra of the post-war years. It was a psychological survival mechanism of the highest order. If you admitted you knew, you admitted you were a part of a criminal enterprise. By claiming total ignorance, you could claim the status of a victim of Hitler's lies, a victim of the Allied bombs, and a victim of a secret regime that had betrayed its own people. But history tells us that this silence was not a void of knowledge. It was an active, energetic choice. Even in the summer of 1945, the evidence of knowing was visible in the mundane details of post-war life. When the Allied investigators began searching homes, they found that many German families were still using the property of the victims. In the displaced persons camps, Jewish survivors often saw local Germans walking past wearing coats, watches, or jewelry that had belonged to their murdered families. Items bought at the Aryanization auctions that had been a regular feature of German life just a few years before. The gold that had been extracted from the teeth of the victims was sitting in the vaults of the Reichsbank, and the records of the local companies that had supplied the ovens and the gas were still sitting in the filing cabinets of ordinary office clerks. The open secret was not a ghost. It was a physical inheritance. It was in the silver spoons on the table and the blankets on the bed. The silence was required, because to speak would be to admit that the very comforts of their lives were built upon the dispossession of their neighbors. In the homes of ordinary citizens, the memory was tucked away in drawers and under floorboards. Thousands of soldiers returning from the front brought back their souvenir photographs of mass shootings in the East. They didn't destroy them immediately, they hid them. They hid the letters that described the actions in Poland. They hid the memory of the striped people they had worked alongside in the factories. This period saw the birth of the victim myth. By focusing on the expulsion of Germans from the East and the horrific Allied bombing raids, the public could displace the memory of the Holocaust. If everyone is a victim, then the specific suffering of the Jewish people could be folded into a generalized narrative of wartime misery. As the Nuremberg trials began in late 1945, the open secret was finally put on the stand. The world watched as the high-ranking Nazis claimed they were just following orders, and that the final solution was a secret even from them. But the testimony of the survivors and the sheer weight of the captured documents, meticulously kept by the Nazi bureaucracy, told a different story. The trials revealed that the Holocaust was a national effort that involved the civil service, the military, the judiciary, and the industrial sector. The ordinary German followed the trials with a mixture of fascination and deep resentment. Many felt that the world was unfairly blaming them for the actions of a few fanatics. They turned inward. This period began the Great Silence of the 1950s. As West Germany began its economic miracle, or Wirtschaftswunder, the country was rebuilt with staggering speed. But the foundations of that new society were built directly over the open secret. The judges who had sent people to their deaths under the Nuremberg laws were often still on the bench. The teachers who had taught racial science were still in the classrooms. The managers who had overseen slave labor were still in the boardrooms. Everyone knew who their neighbors were and what they had done, but a social pact was formed. If you don't ask about my past, I won't ask about yours. This was the leaden time. It was a world of don't ask. Children grew up in homes where there were forbidden zones in their parents' memories. They saw the uncle who visited and spoke in hushed tones about the East. They saw the way their fathers looked when a newsreel showed the camps. The knowledge was there, but it was a knowledge without a voice. It would take 20 years for the open secret to finally be exhumed by a new generation. In the 1960s, the children of the war generation reached adulthood and began to look at their parents with a newfound, agonizing clarity. They asked the question that the Allies had asked in 1945. What did you do? What did you see? Why didn't you say anything? This was the era of the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, where the ordinary men who had worked as guards and administrators were finally brought to justice. For the first time, the open secret was debated at the dinner table. The great silence was broken, not by the world, but by the children who refused to inherit the amnesia of their parents. As we look back at the 0 hour of 1945, we see that it was not an end, but a beginning. It was the start of a long, agonizing process of admitting that the secret had never been a secret. It was the realization that a nation's soul cannot be rebuilt on a foundation of lies. The German people had seen the yellow benches. They had walked over the broken glass. They had used the furniture of the evacuated, and they had watched the death marches pass their windows. In 1945, the bill for that looking away was finally presented, and the price was a burden of memory that would last for generations. The reconstruction of Germany was not just a matter of bricks and mortar. It was a matter of the spirit. It was the slow, painful work of admitting that the quiet knowing was its own form of participation. As the new Germany eventually emerged as a bastion of democracy and human rights, it did so by finally embracing the weight of its own history. The open secret was finally laid to rest, not through forgetting, but through the courage to remember everything: the glass, the stars, the trains, and the silence itself. The story of 1945 is a story of how humanity survives the knowledge of its own capacity for indifference. It reminds us that the truth is always there, waiting in the shadows of our daily lives, and that the greatest challenge is not in finding it, but in having the courage to look at it without blinking. The path from the 0 hour to the present has been a journey toward the light, teaching us that we are all witnesses to our time, and that our most sacred duty is to keep our eyes open, to speak the truth even when it is dangerous, and to never let the shadows of indifference cover the world again. The ghosts of 1945 continue to speak to us today. They tell us that the truth is the only sanctuary, and that memory is the only way to honor those who were lost in the shadows. As we look at the ruins and the graves of that time, we see not just the end of a war, but the birth of a new responsibility. A responsibility to see, to know, and to never look away again. The open secret is open now for all the world to see. And in that seeing, we find the strength to build a future where the silence is finally broken, and the truth is finally allowed to breathe. As the smoke of the mid-century finally cleared, a new landscape emerged, one where the names of the camps became part of the geography of the human conscience. The German people began the work of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, a process that has no end date. It is a daily practice of remembrance, an ongoing dialogue between the present and the knowing of the past. It is the realization that even when the buildings are rebuilt and the streets are cleaned, the history remains etched into the very stones, waiting for each new generation to acknowledge the truth of what was seen, what was heard, and what was known. This legacy of 1945 is perhaps the most important part of the story. It shows that while a nation can be led into darkness by 1,000 small silences, it can only be led back into the light by 1,000 acts of honesty. The open secret was the tragedy of a people who chose to be blind. The revelation of 1945 was the painful, necessary restoration of sight. And in that restoration, we find the hope that the next time the shadows begin to grow, we will have the courage to stand in the light and call the darkness by its true name. The open secret did not dissolve when the last of the rubble was cleared from the streets of Berlin, nor did it vanish when the new Deutschmark began to circulate in the pockets of a rebuilding nation. Instead, it entered a new and deeply complicated afterlife. This is the story of how the knowing of the war years traveled through the decades, from the cold, protective silence of the 1950s to the explosive confrontations of the 1960s, and finally into the very heart of modern Germany's identity. It is a story of how a nation moves from a great silence to a great remembering, and what happens to a secret when it is finally, irrevocably laid bare. As the 1950s dawned, West Germany was a hive of frantic, almost desperate activity. This was the era of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. In the rush to rebuild shattered cities, to construct modern glass and steel apartments, and to fill the roads with gleaming Volkswagens, there was a collective, unspoken agreement. The past was a closed book, and the key had been thrown away. If the years of the war were a fever, then the 50s were a period of convalescence where no one wanted to talk about the illness. This was what historians often call the leaden time. The open secret was not gone. It was simply buried beneath a layer of newfound prosperity. In the living rooms of this new Germany, the silence was thick, almost physical. Imagine a typical family dinner in 1955. The father comes home from his job at a rebuilt factory or a government office and sits down to eat. His face is a mask of middle-class normalcy. He is the same man who, 10 years earlier, may have been a soldier on the Eastern Front, a railway clerk managing special transports, or a guard at a subcamp. The mother, who may have bought Aryanized furniture in 1942, now polishes that same mahogany table with a quiet, focused intensity. The children, the first generation born after the fire, sensed the forbidden zones in their parents' minds. They knew instinctively that there were topics that would turn the room cold, questions that would make their father's eyes go distant and hard. The knowledge of what had happened was there, but it was like a ghost in the house. Everyone felt its presence, but no one dared to name it. This silence was not merely a social convention, it was built into the very structure of the state. Because the Nazi regime had been so total, its machinery had involved almost everyone. To purge every person who knew or participated would have meant the collapse of the country. And so, many of the civil servants, the judges who had signed death warrants, the doctors who had participated in euthanasia, and the teachers who had taught racial purity remained in their posts. A mutual protection pact was formed between the elite and the ordinary citizen, a pact of don't ask, don't tell. If you don't ask about my 1942, I won't ask about yours. This was the second silence, a period where the nation tried to outrun its shadow by moving as fast as possible into a consumerist future. They were building a new world on top of a graveyard, hoping that the concrete would be thick enough to keep the memories down. But shadows have a way of lengthening as the day progresses. The turning point began to emerge in the early 1960s. The children of the war generation were reaching adulthood. They were university students, and they were looking at their parents and their professors with a new, agonizing clarity. They began to notice the discrepancies, the gaps in the history books, the sudden silences when the war was mentioned. They began to ask the questions that had been suppressed for 20 years. Where were you, Father? What did you see? Why is the man who judged our Jewish neighbors still sitting on the local bench? Why is our history teacher skipping the years between 1933 and 1945? The spark that finally lit this fire was the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965. For the first time, ordinary Germans were brought before a German court, under German law, to answer for their roles in the machinery of death. These were not the high-ranking monsters of the Nuremberg trials. These were the neighbors. They were the dental technicians, the postmen, the clerks, and the mid-level guards. These were men who had returned to their lives, raised families, and been good citizens for 2 decades. The trials were a seismic shock to the German public. The testimony was broadcast into every home via the radio and the evening news. The open secret was finally being named in a German voice, in a German courtroom. The student protests of 1968 were not just about global politics. They were a visceral, generational revolt against the Great Silence. The youth demanded that the knowing of their parents be turned into acknowledging. They refused to inherit a legacy of amnesia. They wanted the truth, no matter how much it hurt the family unit. This was the moment the open secret truly died. replaced by a painful public investigation that would last for the rest of the century. As the 1970s and 80s arrived, the knowing shifted from a legal confrontation to an emotional one. In 1979, an American miniseries titled Holocaust was broadcast on West German television. It is hard to overstate the impact this had. Millions of Germans tuned in, and for many, the fictionalized story of the Weiss family did what decades of dry documentaries and court transcripts could not. It broke the emotional dam. People who had spent 30 years not knowing suddenly found themselves weeping at their kitchen tables. The abstract numbers, the 6 million, became faces. The open secret was no longer just a historical fact. It was an emotional reality that had to be mourned. This era also saw profound political gestures that signaled a change in the national soul. In 1970, Chancellor Willy Brandt traveled to the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. There, in a moment of spontaneous humility that stunned the world, he fell to his knees before the memorial to the victims. He was a man who had himself been a member of the resistance, yet he took upon his shoulders the weight of the knowing of his entire nation. His knee-fall, genuflection, was a signal that Germany was finally ready to stop running from its shadow and to start living in its light. As the decades passed and Germany was eventually reunified, the knowing became the very foundation of the modern state. Germany moved toward a unique form of national identity, one built not on pride in military conquest or ancient myths, but on the solemn responsibility for its past. This is the concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past. It is a word that has no direct translation, because no other nation has attempted the process on this scale or with this level of institutional commitment. It is the active, daily work of dismantling the open secret and ensuring it can never be reconstructed. Today, this knowing is visible in the very streets where it was once ignored. If you walk through any German city today, you will see small brass plaques embedded in the sidewalk, flush with the cobblestones. These are the Stolperstein, or stumbling stones, created by the artist Gunter Demnig. Each one is hand-stamped with the name of a person who once lived in the building behind it: a Jewish neighbor, a Romani family, a political dissident, and the date they were deported and murdered. They are placed there so that the modern citizen literally stumbles with their eyes over the memory of the person who was taken. They ensure that the open secret of the 1940s, the sight of neighbors being marched away in broad daylight, is now a permanent part of the urban landscape. You cannot walk to work or to a cafe without being reminded that history happened right here, under these very feet. In the center of Berlin, in the shadow of the Brandenburg Gate and the Reichstag, sits the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. It is a vast, undulating field of 2,711 concrete slabs of varying heights. To walk through it is to experience a sense of growing disorientation, a feeling of being swallowed by a silence that is both heavy and hollow. It is a monument to the victims, certainly, but it is also a monument to the knowing of the witnesses. It stands in the heart of the capital as a permanent physical refusal to ever again look away. It is a site where the open secret has been given a massive, unmissable form. Modern German education has turned the knowing into a shield. Every child in Germany is taught this history not as a series of distant dates, but as a lesson in civic responsibility. They visit the camps, they read the diaries of those who lived in their own towns, and they are taught to look for the early signs of the salami slicing of human rights. They are taught that the open secret was made possible not just by the leaders, but by the millions of small, daily decisions to stay silent, to keep one's head down, and to prioritize personal comfort over the lives of others. The knowing of the ancestors has been transformed into the watchfulness of the descendants. As we look back at the entirety of this journey, we see that the story of what the German people knew is really a story about the human condition itself. It is a story of how a society can be led into the darkness by 1,000 small silences. We saw the yellow benches of 1934, the broken glass of 1938, the Sonderzug on the railway sidings in 1942, and the ghosts of the death marches in 1945. We saw how the open secret was a burden that everyone carried but few spoke of, a weight that stayed in the pit of the stomach and the back of the mind. But we also see the resolution. We see that while a nation can be blinded by fear, greed, and propaganda, it can also choose to restore its sight. The open secret is no longer a secret. It is a shared, painful, and vital part of the human story. It reminds us that we are all, at every moment, the keepers of our neighbour's dignity. It tells us that the most dangerous silence is not the silence of the forest, but the silence of the city street when the neighbour is taken. It tells us that knowing is not enough. One must also acknowledge, and one must also act. The silence of the 1950s has been replaced by a roar of remembrance. The knowing has been voiced in courtrooms, in classrooms, and in the very stones of the streets. And in that voicing, there is a kind of peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of truth. The modern German identity is perhaps the only one in the world that is anchored in the memory of its own greatest failure. It is a nation that has learned that the only way to a healthy future is through a thorough, unsparing investigation of the past. The cobblestones of Germany still remember the wooden shoes of the death marches, but they also feel the footsteps of a people who have vowed never to let the darkness grow that long again. The open secret is open now, and in its openness, we find the strength to build a world where every neighbour is seen, every voice is heard, and every chair is filled. The long night of the mid-century is over, and the lessons of the silence have become the foundation of a new, more resilient democracy. We remember so that we do not have to repeat. We know so that we can protect. And we speak so that the open secret can never, ever return to the shadows. The light of history, however harsh, is the only light that can truly set us free. It asks us to look at the world around us today and to ask ourselves what we are seeing that we are choosing not to perceive. By answering that question, we honor the truth that was so long suppressed, and we ensure that the open secret remains what it must always be: a lesson, a warning, and a promise to never look away again. As the story of the open secret concludes, we are left with the realization that history is not something that happens to us. It is something we create through our actions and our silences. The knowing of the German people during the war was a heavy burden, but the remembering of the German people today is a gift to the world. It is a testament to the fact that even the deepest darkness can be overcome by the persistent, courageous pursuit of the truth. The glass has been swept up, the stars have been removed, the trains have stopped running, but the memory remains, a quiet, steady flame that lights the way toward a more compassionate and honest future. The story we have followed, from the shattered storefronts of 1938 to the silent dinner tables of the 1950s, is more than a chronicle of a distant war. It is a study of the human soul under pressure. It is a map of how easily a civilized society can drift into the unthinkable, not through a single leap into the abyss, but through 1,000 tiny, quiet concessions. As we stand here in the present, Looking back at the open secret, we must realize that the machinery of silence was not a unique invention of the 1940s. It is a dormant capacity within all of us, a psychological shadow that can lengthen whenever fear, indifference, or the desire for comfort begins to outweigh our commitment to the truth. History does not repeat itself in exact rhymes, but it often follows the same rhythm. When we ask how the German people lived with what they knew, we are really asking how any society lives with the knowledge of injustice. The open secret was built on a foundation of selective looking away. It thrived because it was easier to focus on the rising cost of bread or the threat of foreign enemies than to ask why the apartment next door was suddenly vacant. It thrived because people were taught to categorize their neighbors not as fellow humans, but as abstractions, as problems to be solved or threats to be managed. In the modern world, the echoes of this process are all around us. We live in an age of unprecedented information, yet we are perhaps more susceptible to the open secret than ever before. In our digital bubbles, we have perfected the art of filtering out the uncomfortable. We can witness a crisis on the other side of the planet, or even in our own cities, and with a single flick of a thumb, we can make it disappear from our screens and our minds. We have developed a high-tech version of the quiet knowing. We know of the child labor that produces our electronics. We know of the environmental degradation that fuels our lifestyles. We know of the marginalized groups who are slowly being pushed to the edges of our political discourse. Like the citizens of the 1930s, we often choose the path of inner emigration, retreating into our private comforts, while the yellow benches of the modern era are being painted right before our eyes. Vigilance is not a state of being, it is an action. It is the refusal to let the open secret take root. It begins with the courage to call things by their true names. The Nazi regime's greatest weapon was the corruption of language, using words like evacuation to mean murder and special treatment to mean death. Today, when we see dehumanizing language creeping back into our public square, when we see people being described as infestations or swarms, we are seeing the first stones of the wall of silence being laid. If we do not speak up then, we find that by the time the trains are running, it is often too late to stop them. The lesson of the German people is that there is no such thing as a passive bystander. Silence is a form of participation. To look away from an injustice is to give it permission to continue. The open secret teaches us that a society's moral health is not measured by its grand monuments or its economic miracles, but by how it treats those who are most vulnerable, those who have no voice, and those who the state would rather we forget. As you conclude this journey with us, take a moment to look at the world around you. Look for the empty chairs. Look for the whispers that go unchallenged. History is not a museum of dead events. It is a living textbook. It warns us that the open secret can only exist as long as we allow it to. It reminds us that our greatest responsibility is to remain uncomfortable in the face of injustice, to refuse the anesthesia of indifference. We honor the past not by merely feeling sorry for the victims, but by becoming the kind of citizens who would have stood up for them. We break the cycle of the open secret by choosing to see, by choosing to know, and by choosing to act. The truth is never a burden. It is a sanctuary. And in a world that often asks us to blink, the most revolutionary act we can perform is to keep our eyes wide open. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of history's most difficult chapters. If this exploration has moved you or made you see the present in a different light, we invite you to reflect on what open secrets might be hiding in our own time. In our next episodes, we will continue to explore the quiet corners of the past, seeking the lessons that can help us build a more vigilant and compassionate future. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and above all, stay vigilant. For the history we ignore today is the reality we will have to live with tomorrow. The light of truth is in your hands. Keep it burning bright.